Welcome. Find a comfortable position. If you are lying down, let your body settle. Feel the weight of your limbs against the surface beneath you. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands open. If your mind is still moving, still turning over the day, still carrying things that felt urgent an hour ago, that is fine. You do not need to clear your mind. You only need to let it rest, the way a river rests when it finally reaches flat ground and spreads wide and still. For the next hour, there is nowhere to go, nothing to decide, nothing to resolve. Tonight, we are going to travel east, to the edge of two worlds, to the place where Europe ends and Asia begins, where a narrow strip of water has been for 3,000 years, one of the most contested and consequential passages on the face of the earth. We are going to watch an empire rise from a small tribe of horsemen on a forgotten frontier and grow over 6 centuries into one of the largest and most enduring political structures in the history of the world. We are going to watch it govern and build and reach its magnificent peak, and then slowly, over generations, begin the long work of letting go. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your breathing slow, and let me take you there. The year is 1299. The place, a small piece of territory in northwestern Anatolia, what is now northwestern Turkey, near the city of Söğüt. The land here is rolling and dry in summer, cold in winter. Oak trees grow on the hillsides. There are sheep on the plain. The sky in the evenings turns extraordinary colors over the distant mountains. A man named Osman is sleeping. He is the leader of a small Turkish tribal group, the Kaya, one of dozens of such groups that had been moving westward across Anatolia for generations, pushed by the great migrations out of Central Asia, settling where they could find pasture and water and a measure of safety from the larger powers around them. Osman is not powerful by the standards of his world. He controls a small border territory on the fringe of what remains of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines are to his west, once the most formidable Christian empire in the world, now old and weakened and contracting, pulling back toward their great city on the Bosphorus. To his east are larger, more established Turkish kingdoms. Osman sits between them all, in a narrow strip of frontier land that nobody particularly wanted. But Osman has something that does not show on any map of territory. He has a dream. The dream, as it was recorded later by the historians of his dynasty, always with the understanding that such stories are as much myth as memory, goes like this. Osman falls asleep in the house of a holy man, a scholar and mystic named Edebali. And in the dream, a moon rises from Edebali's chest and descends into Osman's own chest. From Osman's navel then grows a great tree. The tree grows until its shade covers the whole world. Beneath the shade of the tree, 4 mountain ranges rise, the Caucasus, the Atlas, the Taurus, and the Balkan, and 4 rivers flow, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and the Danube. Ships sail on the rivers. Cities shine at the river mouths. People come from everywhere to rest beneath the tree. When Osman wakes, he tells Edebali what he has seen. Edebali tells him, God has given you and your descendants sovereignty over the world. Whether the dream happened or not, whether it was a real vision, a later invention, or something in between, the story served its purpose. It gave a small, marginal tribe on a forgotten frontier a sense of destiny, a reason to push forward when the easier choice would have been to stay small. Osman began to push forward. He raided Byzantine territory. He won battles against larger forces. He attracted followers, not just Turks, but men of various origins who were drawn by the promise of land and plunder and something harder to name. A sense that something new was being built, that this particular leader on this particular patch of ground was going somewhere. By the time Osman died, around 1326, his small principality had absorbed several Byzantine towns and grown into something that could genuinely be called a state. His son Orhan captured the city of Bursa, which became the first Ottoman capital. Orhan minted coins. He built mosques and schools and caravanserai, the roadside inns that enabled long-distance trade. He began to develop the institutions of governance. The dream was becoming architecture. Over the following century, Osman's descendants pushed in every direction. Into the Balkans, crossing the Dardanelles Strait into Europe for the first time in 1354, into Thrace, into Bulgaria, into Serbia. The Ottoman army won battle after battle, absorbing the armies it defeated and the territories it conquered, growing larger with each campaign. At the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, the Ottoman Sultan Murad I defeated a coalition of Balkan Christian forces and secured Ottoman dominance over the region. The battle cost Murad his life. He was assassinated in the aftermath by a Serbian nobleman who pretended to surrender. But the strategic result was clear. The Ottomans were in Europe, and they were staying. By 1400, the Ottoman Empire controlled a vast arc of territory from western Anatolia through Thrace and into the Balkans, with only one prize still out of reach, the city that sat at the center of it all, the jewel that every ambitious ruler in the region had dreamed of for 1,000 years. Constantinople. Let me describe Constantinople to you. Not as it is now, Istanbul, a city of 16 million people, one of the great metropolises of the modern world, but as it was in the middle of the 15th century, at the moment the Ottoman Empire turned its full attention toward it. Constantinople sits on a triangular peninsula where Europe and Asia nearly touch, where the Bosphorus, the narrow strait connecting the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, meets the Golden Horn, a natural harbor so well protected that it has been used continuously by sailors for 3,000 years. The city's walls were built in the 5th century AD under the Emperor Theodosius II. They had been repaired and expanded over the following 1,000 years until they formed one of the most formidable defensive structures ever built. The land walls, the great double walls with a moat, stretched nearly 7 kilometers across the neck of the peninsula. They were built in 3 layers, first the moat, then an outer wall, then the inner wall rising 18 meters high, studded with towers at regular intervals. Invaders who crossed the moat faced the outer wall. If they crossed that, they found themselves in a killing ground between the 2 walls, with defenders firing from both sides. In 1,000 years, no attacker had successfully breached these walls from the land side. The city had withstood Arab sieges in the 7th and 8th centuries. It had withstood Bulgarian attacks. It had withstood a Rus fleet in 860 AD. It had been taken only once, in 1204, when the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade, diverted from their journey to the Holy Land by Venetian political maneuvering, turned their weapons on the Christian city they had been sent to pass through. That wound, the sack by fellow Christians, the looting of churches and palaces by men who carried crosses on their cloaks, had never fully healed. But the Ottomans were a different kind of threat from any Constantinople had faced before. They had time. They had patience. They had resources that dwarfed anything the exhausted Byzantine Empire could muster in its defense. And they had, in the young Sultan who had taken the throne in 1451, a man for whom taking Constantinople was not merely a military objective, but something close to a personal obsession. His name was Mehmed II. He was 21 years old when he became Sultan for the second time. He had briefly held the throne as a boy before being pushed aside by his father, an experience that had marked him permanently with a particular kind of cold, self-contained determination. He was educated beyond most rulers of his age. He spoke 6 languages fluently. He read Greek and Latin. He had studied military history with genuine intellectual interest, not merely as a professional obligation. He read accounts of Alexander the Great's campaigns. He studied the techniques of previous sieges of Constantinople, and he commissioned the largest cannon ever built. The cannon was designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine V. Constantine could not afford him. Mehmed could. Orban's great cannon, later called the Basilica, was nearly 9 meters long. It fired stone balls weighing over half a ton. When tested for the first time, the sound of it was heard reportedly from 15 kilometers away. Women in the surrounding villages, who had not been warned, miscarried from the shock. It took 60 oxen and 200 men to move it. Mehmed had several such cannons built. In the spring of 1453, the Ottoman army, perhaps 80,000 soldiers, though sources vary widely, arrived before the walls of Constantinople. The Byzantine garrison defending the city numbered fewer than 8,000 men. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine V Palaiologos, had sent desperate requests for help to every Christian ruler in Europe. Almost no help came. The world knew what was happening, and the world, occupied with its own affairs, mostly watched from a distance. The siege lasted 53 days. The great cannons fired. Day after day, the stone balls struck the Theodosian walls, walls that had stood for 1,000 years, and sections began to crack and crumble. The defenders worked through the nights to repair the damage with timber and earth, filling the breaches as fast as the cannon fire opened them. It was exhausting work. The Byzantines inside the city were running out of everything: men, food, hope. The Golden Horn, the harbor on the northern side of the city, was sealed by a great chain that the Byzantines had stretched across the water, preventing Ottoman ships from sailing into the harbor and attacking the city from the sea. Mehmed's response was one of the most audacious logistical moves in military history. He ordered his ships moved overland. Working through a single night, teams of oxen and hundreds of men hauled 70 Ottoman warships on greased wooden rollers over a hill and down into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain entirely. By morning, the harbor the Byzantines had believed was secure was filled with enemy warships. The city was surrounded on all sides. In the early hours of May 29, 1453, Mehmed ordered the final assault. The attack came in waves. The first waves, irregular forces from the fringes of the Ottoman army, were sent to tire the defenders. Then came the Anatolian troops. Then, in the gray light before dawn, the Janissaries, the elite infantry, trained from boyhood, the finest soldiers in the Ottoman military. At a gate called the Kirkoperda, a small postern gate in the wall that had been left unlocked by mistake, or left open by a defender who slipped away. The accounts vary. The Ottoman soldiers found a gap. They poured through. Constantine the Palaiologos, the last emperor of Rome, for the Byzantine emperors had always considered themselves the true continuation of the Roman Empire, removed his imperial regalia when he understood what was happening. He put on the armor of an ordinary soldier. He was last seen charging into the breach, fighting on foot, sword in hand. His body was never positively identified. He simply vanished into the final hours of a civilization that had lasted, in one form or another, for over 1,000 years. Mehmed II entered the city later that day on horseback. He rode to the Hagia Sophia, the great church built by the Emperor Justinian 900 years before, its dome still the largest in the Christian world, its interior a vast golden space that had witnessed the coronations of emperors and the prayers of generations. He dismounted at the entrance. He bent down and took a handful of earth. He poured it over his turban, a gesture of humility before God, a reminder that all earthly conquest is temporary. Then he went inside. He ordered a muezzin to climb to the gallery and call the Muslim prayer. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque. The city was renamed. The Ottomans called it Constantinople in Turkish, and later simply Istanbul, which may derive from a Greek phrase meaning in the city or to the city, the phrase that travelers and merchants had always used when speaking of the one city in the region so famous it needed no other name. Mehmed, from this day forward, added a new title to his name, Fatih, the Conqueror. He was 21 years old. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through the Christian world. The news reached Rome on July 8, 1453, and Pope Nicholas V reportedly wept. In Venice, the church bells rang in mourning. The Byzantine scholars who had fled the city in the preceding years, carrying manuscripts, carrying memories, carrying the accumulated learning of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, scattered across Italy and contributed directly to the intellectual ferment of what we now call the Renaissance. One world had ended, another was beginning. Over the following century, the Ottoman Empire continued to grow. Egypt fell in 1517. The Mamluk sultans who had ruled from Cairo were defeated, and with them came control of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, giving the Ottoman Sultan a religious authority that extended far beyond his military reach. The title of Caliph, the leader of the Sunni Muslim world, passed in practice, if not always in formal designation, to the Ottoman house. Syria came under Ottoman rule. Iraq, much of the Arabian Peninsula. The empire stretched from Budapest in the northwest to the Persian Gulf in the southeast, from Algiers in the west to the borders of Persia in the east. But it was under the reign of the 10th Sultan, Suleiman, who came to the throne in 1520, that the Ottoman Empire reached its absolute zenith. The Ottomans called him Kanuni, the lawgiver. The Europeans called him Suleiman the Magnificent. Both names are accurate. Both miss something. Let me tell you about Suleiman. He was 46 years into his reign when he died on campaign in Hungary in 1566, still leading his armies personally at the age of 71. By that point, he had governed the largest empire in the world for 46 years, conducted 13 major military campaigns, and supervised the construction of some of the most beautiful buildings in the history of human architecture. He had also, in the quiet hours between campaigns, written poetry. Under the pen name Muhibi the Beloved, he wrote thousands of verses in the Divan tradition of Ottoman poetry. They are poems about love, about longing, about the impermanence of power. This man who commanded armies of 100,000, who could have any man in his empire executed with a word, spent his evenings writing about the fragility of the human heart. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman legal code was systematized and expanded into one of the most comprehensive bodies of law in the medieval world. The Kanun, the secular legal code, worked alongside Islamic law to govern commerce, criminal justice, land rights, and the relationship between the state and its subjects. Suleiman did not merely conquer territories. He thought carefully about how to govern them fairly. He appointed the great architect Mimar Sinan as his chief architect. Sinan was a Christian-born Devshirme, a man taken from his family in boyhood as part of the Ottoman system of recruiting talent from subject peoples, converted to Islam, educated in the palace, and given opportunities that his birth circumstances could never have offered him. Sinan designed and built 362 structures across the empire. Mosques, hospitals, bridges, caravanserai, palaces, aqueducts, schools. His work changed the skyline of Istanbul permanently. The Süleymaniye Mosque, built on one of the 7 hills of Istanbul between 1550 and 1557, is considered his masterwork before his true masterwork, the Selimiye in Edirne. Let me take you there for a moment. To the Süleymaniye on an early morning. The city is still quiet. The light is coming in from the east over the Bosphorus, turning the water gold. From the mosque's courtyard, you can see the Golden Horn below, and beyond it, across the water, the hills of Asia. The smell of the city, bread, sea, stone warmed by the previous day's sun, drifts up through the cypress trees. Inside, the dome rises 53 meters above the marble floor. The walls are pierced with 138 windows, each admitting a different quality of light at different hours of the day. In the morning, the light is pale and directional. By afternoon, it becomes diffuse, golden, filling the space without a single obvious source. In one corner of the garden, in a simple tomb, Suleiman and his wife Hürrem are buried side by side. Hürrem, known to Europeans as Roxolana, a Slavic girl born in what is now Ukraine, enslaved and brought to the imperial harem, who rose through a combination of intelligence and force of personality to become the most powerful woman in Ottoman history, and, some historians argue, one of the most politically influential women of the 16th century. She corresponded with foreign rulers. She commissioned charitable works. She was the first concubine in Ottoman history to be formally married to a sultan. Suleiman's letters to her, which survive, read like a man genuinely, almost helplessly, in love. The Ottoman Empire at its peak was not simply a military state. It was a civilization. Istanbul in 1550 was the largest city in Europe, with a population of around 700,000, dwarfing London, Paris, and Rome. Its markets carried goods from China and India, from sub-Saharan Africa and Northern Europe. Its scholars debated philosophy and mathematics and medicine. Its poets competed at the court of the Sultan. Its architects built with a confidence and a precision that would not be exceeded in the region for centuries. 3 continents touched inside its borders. 3 great religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, coexisted within its cities. Each community governed largely by its own laws and leaders in a system called the millet, which, while imperfect and hierarchical, was notably more tolerant of religious diversity than most of contemporaneous Europe. This was the world that Suleiman inherited and expanded and, in the end, bequeathed to his successors. They did not always know what to do with it. Let me explain how the Ottoman Empire actually worked. because one of the most remarkable things about it, and one of the things that made it so durable, was the sophistication of its administrative machinery. The empire was not simply a military force with a flag. It was a system for governing enormous diversity across an enormous geography, and it ran, for several centuries, with a coherence that most other states of its era could not match. At the center of everything was the Sultan. In theory, the Sultan's power was absolute. He was the shadow of God on earth. His word was law. His approval was required for every major decision of state. But in practice, the Ottoman system distributed real power across a sophisticated bureaucracy. The Grand Vizier was the empire's chief minister, the man who ran the day-to-day government, commanded armies, received foreign ambassadors, and managed the vast apparatus of the imperial administration. Some Grand Viziers were the true rulers of the empire in all but name, while the Sultan concerned himself with ceremony and pleasure. Others were brilliant soldiers and statesmen who worked in genuine partnership with capable sultans. The Grand Vizier worked from the Topkapı Palace complex in Istanbul, a city within a city on the tip of the peninsula, surrounded by walls, divided into progressively more restricted courtyards. The outer courtyard was accessible to anyone: merchants, petitioners, visitors. The second courtyard was where official business was conducted. The third was the inner palace, where the Sultan lived and worked. The fourth was a series of gardens and pavilions overlooking the Bosphorus. The harem, the private household of the Sultan, was a world unto itself. The word harem simply means forbidden in Arabic. It referred to the private family quarters of any Muslim household, not merely the palace. In the Ottoman imperial context, it was an enormous domestic and political institution housing hundreds of women: the Sultan's mother, his wives, his concubines, his sisters and daughters, and their attendants. The women of the harem were not simply decorative. The Sultan's mother, the Valid Sultan, was often the most politically powerful individual in the empire, managing alliances, directing patronage, and influencing succession. The competition among mothers of princes to position their sons for the throne was fierce and occasionally lethal. Ottoman succession had no fixed rule of primogeniture. No automatic right of the eldest son to inherit. The throne went to whichever prince was capable of taking and holding it. For centuries, this meant that when a new sultan came to power, his brothers and half-brothers were strangled with a silken cord, a tradition called fratricide, carried out to prevent civil war. Cold, systematic, terrible, and from the Ottoman perspective, pragmatic. One of the empire's most distinctive institutions was the devshirme, the levy of boys. At irregular intervals, Ottoman officials would travel through the Christian communities of the Balkans and select boys, typically between 8 and 18 years old, healthy, intelligent, the most promising of their villages. These boys were taken from their families, converted to Islam, brought to Istanbul, educated in the palace school, and trained for service to the empire. This sounds, and in many ways was, an act of profound violation. The separation of children from their families, the erasure of their original religion and identity. And yet the system also offered something that the rigid social structures of medieval Europe almost never did: the possibility of radical social mobility. A boy born a Serbian peasant could, through the devshirme, become a general, a governor, a grand vizier, one of the most powerful men in the world. Many did. The great Janissary Corps, the Ottoman elite infantry that was the most feared military force in the Mediterranean world for 2 centuries, was almost entirely composed of devshirme men. They were paid well, housed in their own barracks, governed by their own laws, and fiercely loyal to the Sultan, who was, in a very real sense, their patron and protector. The empire was also sustained by a vast network of trade. Istanbul sat at the intersection of the great overland trade routes connecting Asia and Europe. The Silk Road, the spice routes, the routes carrying grain and timber and metals, all of them passed through or near Ottoman territory. The empire taxed this trade and grew wealthy from it. Its bazaars were the greatest commercial centers in the world. The Grand Bazaar of Istanbul, begun under Mehmed the Conqueror in the 1450s and expanded over the following centuries, eventually covered 61 streets, 4,000 shops, and employed tens of thousands of merchants, craftsmen, and laborers. It is still there, still operating, one of the oldest and largest covered markets in the world. No empire lasts forever. The Ottoman Empire declined slowly over 2.5 centuries, in a process so gradual and so interrupted by periods of apparent recovery that contemporaries often could not see it clearly while it was happening. The turning point that historians most often point to is the year 1683. That year, the Ottoman Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led an enormous army, perhaps 140,000 men, to the gates of Vienna. Vienna was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, the great rival of the Ottomans in Central Europe. Taking Vienna would open the door to the heart of Europe. It would be the greatest Ottoman conquest since Constantinople. The siege lasted 2 months. Kara Mustafa's army surrounded the city. The Viennese defenders, outnumbered and running out of supplies, sent desperately for help. On September 12, 1683, a relief army arrived. Polish, Habsburg, and German forces under the command of the Polish King John III Sobieski. They attacked from the high ground of the Kahlenberg Hill above the city. The battle lasted less than a day. The Ottoman army broke and fled. It was the largest cavalry charge in European history, nearly 18,000 horsemen descending the hill, and it shattered the Ottoman lines completely. Kara Mustafa retreated to Belgrade, where he was strangled on orders from the Sultan. His head was sent back to Istanbul in a velvet bag. The defeat at Vienna did not end the Ottoman Empire, but it marked, unmistakably, the high watermark of Ottoman expansion into Europe. From this point forward, the military balance shifted. The Ottomans began slowly and reluctantly to give ground they had held for generations. Over the following century, the structural problems that had been building for decades became harder to ignore. The Janissaries, once the empire's greatest military asset, had become a conservative political force opposed to any reform that might reduce their privileges. They had begun to accept the sons of existing members, destroying the Devshirme principle of talent selected on merit. They had entered trade and commerce, developing economic interests that sometimes conflicted directly with the interests of the state. They had deposed sultans they disliked. They had murdered grand viziers they found inconvenient. A military force that had been designed to serve the state had become, in effect, a state within the state. The empire's finances deteriorated. The flood of silver from the New World that poured into European economies in the 16th and 17th centuries caused inflation across the Mediterranean and disrupted the Ottoman tax base. New sea routes around Africa bypassed Ottoman-controlled overland trade routes, reducing the revenues the empire had always drawn from transit trade. European powers, particularly Russia, Austria, and later Britain and France, grew stronger while the Ottoman center struggled to keep pace. New military technologies, new organizational models, new industrial capacities made European armies increasingly formidable. The Ottomans, aware of the problem, attempted reform repeatedly. Most reform efforts were blocked or diluted by conservative resistance. By the 19th century, European observers were calling the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe, a phrase attributed to the Russian Tsar Nicholas I in 1853. The phrase was reductive and often condescending, carrying within it the assumption that European powers were entitled to decide what should happen to Ottoman territory when the empire finally collapsed. But the diagnosis, however crudely expressed, pointed at something real. The empire was losing territory in every direction. Greece gained independence in 1830, after a brutal war of independence that drew romantic adventurers from across Europe, including the poet Lord Byron, who died at Missolonghi in 1824 and became one of the war's most celebrated martyrs. Serbia gained autonomy, Romania, Bulgaria, Bosnia. Each loss was a wound. Each wound drained resources and confidence the empire could not fully replenish. In 1839, the empire began the Tanzimat, a series of sweeping modernization reforms, new courts based on European legal codes, a secular education system, equal rights for non-Muslim subjects regardless of religion, a new emphasis on Ottoman civic identity over religious identity. The reforms were genuine and significant. They were also deeply controversial within the empire, opposed by religious conservatives who saw them as a betrayal of Islamic principles, and by European powers who were simultaneously demanding reforms while competing to dismantle the empire that was trying to carry them out. The empire was being reformed and dismembered at the same time. By 1914, the Ottoman Empire had lost most of its European territory. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, two rapid, catastrophic conflicts, had stripped away almost everything that remained west of Istanbul. The empire entered the First World War in October 1914 on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoping that a German victory would reverse its losses and restore its standing among the great powers. It was the last great miscalculation. The First World War for the Ottoman Empire was a catastrophe measured in millions. At Gallipoli in 1915, a massive Allied campaign attempted to force open the Dardanelles Strait, knock the Ottomans out of the war, and open a supply route to Russia. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand forces landed on the peninsula in April 1915. What was expected to be a rapid campaign lasted 8 months. Both sides suffered terrible casualties. The Allies ultimately withdrew in January 1916, having gained nothing. For the Ottomans, Gallipoli was a rare victory in a war of almost unrelenting loss. And from that peninsula of blood and stone, it produced the man who would transform everything that came after. His name was Mustafa Kemal. He was 34 years old when the Allied forces landed. Assigned to defend the high ground above the beaches, he made decisions in the first hours of the campaign that most historians consider decisive. When his troops reported they were out of ammunition and could not hold their position, Kemal gave them an order that became, in the years that followed, one of the most quoted sentences in Turkish history. He told them, "I am not ordering you to attack. I am ordering you to die. In the time that passes until we die, other troops and commanders can come forward and take our places." They held, the high ground held. Gallipoli did not fall, and the Allied campaign, expected to be over in weeks, stretched into 8 months of grinding, devastating stalemate before ending in a humiliating withdrawal. Kemal survived when many around him did not, and more than once by margins that felt almost impossible. During one engagement, a piece of shrapnel struck him directly in the chest. It was stopped by his pocket watch. He walked away from that moment, carrying something harder to explain than luck. A conviction, perhaps, that the story was not yet finished, that something larger was still being asked of him. But alongside the military campaigns, in 1915, something else happened, something that has cast a long and unresolved shadow over Ottoman and Turkish history ever since. The Ottoman government, controlled by a committee of nationalist officers called the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, ordered the deportation of the Armenian population of Anatolia. The Armenians, a Christian minority who had lived in eastern Anatolia for centuries, were accused of collaboration with the Russian enemy. What followed was mass killing on an enormous scale. Armenians were deported in forced marches into the Syrian desert, during which hundreds of thousands died of starvation, thirst, exposure, and direct violence. Communities that had existed for 1,000 years were destroyed. The total death toll is estimated by most historians at between 600,000 and 1.5 million people. Whether this constitutes genocide, a term that did not yet exist in 1915, coined later by the legal scholar Raphael Lemkin partly in response to these events, is formally disputed by the Turkish state. It is recognized as genocide by most historians, by the parliaments of many countries, and by the descendants of survivors scattered across the world. The weight of it has never fully settled. The war ended in 1918 with Ottoman defeat. The victorious Allies occupied Istanbul. The Sultan, reduced to a figurehead under Allied supervision, signed treaties ceding vast territories. And then, from a different direction entirely, something unexpected happened. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, refused to accept the surrender. He moved to the Anatolian interior and organized resistance. He built a new army from the remnants of the Ottoman forces and from the Anatolian population, which was fighting to prevent the partition of what it considered its homeland. Between 1919 and 1922, in the Turkish War of Independence, Kemal's forces fought and defeated Greek, Armenian, and French forces across Anatolia. It was brutal, chaotic, and transformative. On November 1st, 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara, the parliament of the new national movement, voted to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, a name that echoed all the way back to the conqueror, boarded a British warship in Istanbul on November 17, 1922, and left the city his dynasty had ruled for nearly 5 centuries. He carried a few bags. He wore a plain dark coat. He left without ceremony. There were no crowds, no speeches. The great empire that had begun with a man and a dream in a small room in northwestern Anatolia simply stepped off a boat and was gone. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed. Mustafa Kemal became its first president. He would later take the surname Atatürk, father of the Turks. The Caliphate, the religious office that had given the Ottoman sultans their authority over the Muslim world, was abolished the following year. 6 centuries, ended in 2 years. But Mustafa Kemal was not finished. He had not fought through Gallipoli and the years of independence to build a smaller version of what had just fallen. He had something different in mind entirely. Something that had never been done on this scale, in this place, in this particular way. What followed in the 15 years between the founding of the Republic and his death in 1938 was one of the most sweeping transformations any single leader has brought to a society in the modern era. A civilization was not merely reorganized, it was rebuilt, deliberately in its speed, on entirely new foundations. The alphabet was changed first. Ottoman Turkish had been written in Arabic script for 5 centuries, a system poorly suited to Turkish sounds, requiring years of study to master, and keeping literacy rates low. In 1928, Ataturk introduced a new Latin-based alphabet. He did not simply sign a decree and send it to be enforced. He toured the country himself, chalkboard in hand, demonstrating the new letters in town squares, sitting with farmers and schoolchildren to teach each character. A leader of a nation, at a chalkboard, teaching his people to read their own language in a new form. Within a year, a country was learning to read itself anew. Within a generation, literacy rates climbed dramatically. The act also severed, by design, the written link to the Ottoman past. A deliberate cut, an insistence that the new Turkey would not be defined by what it was inheriting, but by what it was choosing to build. Islam was separated from the state. Religious courts were replaced by a civil legal code adapted from Switzerland. The Ottoman family law that had governed marriage and inheritance for centuries was replaced with a secular code that gave women equal legal standing. Universities opened to women, the professions opened to women. And in 1934, before France, before Italy, before many countries that considered themselves the civilized vanguard of democratic progress, Turkish women gained the right to vote in national elections. They entered parliament. They became judges, doctors, pilots, professors. This was not incidental to Ataturk's project. It was central to it. A modern country, he believed, could not afford to treat half its population as an afterthought. It needed them as citizens, as full participants in the work of building something worthy of the future. Religious schools were closed and a secular national curriculum was built. The fez was banned. The Gregorian calendar replaced the Ottoman one. The metric system replaced the old measurements. The call to prayer was mandated in Turkish rather than Arabic for a time, a change of vast symbolic weight that divided opinion deeply, but made its point regardless. These reforms were not achieved through consensus. Ataturk was not, in the modern sense, a democrat. He was a man who had decided what Turkey needed and was willing to use state power to bring it into existence. There was resistance. There were people who lost something they valued, a script, a tradition, a sense of continuity, and mourned it genuinely. But the Republic held. The institutions held. And the country that emerged from the Ottoman collapse was not a diminished fragment, but something coherent and forward-facing. A state that could sit at the table of nations without apology. He died on November 10, 1938, at 57 years old, of cirrhosis, a body worn through by years of war and sleepless reform. He died in Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul, in a room overlooking the Bosphorus. At the moment of his death, every clock in the palace was stopped at 9 minutes past 9 in the morning. In Turkey, Every year on November 10th, at 9 minutes past 9, the country stops. Traffic halts. People stand in the streets, sirens sound across every city simultaneously. A long, low note held for a full minute. You can be in a crowded market in Istanbul or a small village in eastern Anatolia, and at that moment, everything goes still. He is buried in Ankara, in a mausoleum called Anıtkabir, the memorial tomb, on a hill above the capital he chose for his republic. Clean white stone, long colonnades, no minarets, no gilded ornament. The building of a man who wanted to be remembered for what he did, not for how richly he could be adorned. And yet it did not simply vanish. Nothing of that scale simply vanishes. The Ottoman Empire at its greatest extent had governed territory that is now divided among more than 40 modern countries. Turkey, of course, but also Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Albania, North Macedonia, Kosovo, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria. The borders of almost every country in the Middle East were drawn, in the immediate aftermath of the Ottoman collapse, by British and French diplomats working with maps and pencils in rooms far from the territories they were dividing. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, the various mandates and treaties that followed, these decisions, made in the chaos and opportunism of post-war diplomacy, created boundaries that cut through tribal territories, separated communities that had always been connected, and joined communities that had little in common. The consequences are still being felt. Every geopolitical conflict in the modern Middle East has Ottoman roots somewhere in its foundation. The question of Jerusalem, the tensions between Arab nationalism and Islam, the borders of Iraq, the political geography of the Balkans, the relationship between Turkey and its Kurdish population, all of them carry at some level the inheritance of the 6th century Ottoman project. The architecture remains. The Hagia Sophia stands, converted to a mosque under Mehmed, converted to a museum under Atatürk in 1934, converted back to a mosque in 2020, still drawing millions of visitors who stand beneath its dome and feel the accumulated weight of 15 centuries of human aspiration pressing down from above. The Suleimaniye stands, the Blue Mosque stands, Topkapi Palace stands, now a museum housing the imperial treasures, the manuscripts, the jewels, the robes of the sultans. The Grand Bazaar still operates. The aqueducts that Sinan built still carry water across the hills of Istanbul. The bridges, the caravanserai, the Hans where merchants once rested their horses and slept above their goods. Hundreds of them still stand across Turkey and the former Ottoman territories. The language remains. Ottoman Turkish was written in Arabic script and was heavily influenced by Arabic and Persian vocabulary. Ataturk replaced it with a Latin alphabet Turkish as part of his radical modernization, a change that created, overnight, a generation of people who could not read the documents and tombstones and books of their grandparents. A deliberate break, an attempt to create distance from the imperial past. But the spoken roots of the language persist, and the Ottoman literary tradition, the poetry, the chronicles, the letters, is being slowly recovered by scholars who have learned to bridge the gap. The food remains. Turkish coffee, baklava, börek, dolmab, yogurt, lokum, what the world calls Turkish delight. These are Ottoman dishes, or dishes that the Ottoman world carried and distributed across 3 continents. When you eat a croissant in Paris, you are, by some accounts, eating a pastry whose crescent shape was invented to celebrate a European victory over the Ottoman army. When you eat rice pilaf or drink ayran or taste halva, the Ottoman world is there in the flavor. 6 centuries of civilization leave their traces everywhere. In architecture and food and language and law and the shapes of the cities and the names of the streets and the music played at weddings in a dozen countries that have not been part of the same political structure for 100 years. Let the images settle now. Osman sleeping in the holy man's house, a moon descending into his chest, a tree growing from his navel until its shade covers the world. The great cannons firing at walls that had stood 1,000 years, the sound of them rolling across the hills of Thrace. Mehmed, 21 years old, pouring dust over his turban in the doorway of the Hagia Sophia. Suleiman in the evening, writing poems about the fragility of the heart in a palace above the Bosphorus. while the largest empire in the world ran on schedules and registers and the careful work of 10,000 administrators. Sinan, very old, he lived to nearly 100, still working, still drawing plans for buildings he knew he would not live to see completed, trusting the stone to carry forward what the body could not. The last sultan, boarding a British warship in the gray November morning, carrying a few bags, not looking back at the city. And Mustafa Kemal, standing at a chalkboard in a dusty town square, chalk in hand, teaching a nation its new alphabet. The same man who had told soldiers to die at Gallipoli, now teaching children to read, still at work, still building. These are all one story, a story of 6 centuries, of a dream becoming an empire, becoming a civilization, becoming a memory, becoming the present, because the present is always made of what came before it. The Bosphorus still runs between 2 continents. The dome of the Hagia Sophia still catches the light in the way that Justinian's engineers designed it to catch the light 1,500 years ago. The dream Osman dreamed, of a tree whose shade covered the world, was not so far from the truth of what his descendants built. It was not permanent. Nothing is permanent. But for 6 centuries, it was real. You are resting now. Your body is heavy and warm and still. Let the Ottoman world drift gently back into the past where it lives. Let the minarets and the market sounds and the smell of the Bosphorus in the morning fade to a soft distance. Let your own thoughts go quiet. You are safe here. You are still. The empire endures, in stone, in language, in the shapes of cities, in the flavor of things. And so do you.